Good evening, brave souls. Tonight we venture into a tale of terror that will grip your heart and haunt your dreams. In the quiet village of Alminya, nestled along the Nile's banks, the whispers of El Naddaha haunted the air. Her story was one every child heard growing up, a woman with a voice so enchanting she could call you from across the river, her song irresistible. But once you followed her voice, you'd never return. Omar never believed the legend. He had heard it countless times from his grandmother as she brewed her tea by the dim light of the kerosene lamp. "Stay away from the riverbank at night," she warned him. El Naddaha is always waiting, always watching. Omar, a young man of 22, had always been curious by nature. Since his father's death, he had taken on the responsibilities of the family, caring for his mother and younger sister. The river had always been a source of comfort for him, a place to think, to escape from the burden of responsibility. But lately, the river felt different, darker, more sinister. One evening, after a long day of work in the fields, Omar sat by the riverbank, the soft lapping of the water calming his weary mind. As he closed his eyes, he heard something, soft, barely audible at first, a voice. It was gentle, melodic, like a lullaby carried on the wind. Omar, his eyes snapped open, heart racing. The voice called again, more clearly this time. Omar. He stood up, scanning the dark horizon. Nothing but the river and the far-off outline of the palm trees, swaying in the night breeze. He had heard the stories, but they were just that, stories. Yet this voice, this whisper, it was real. The next morning, Omar mentioned it to his friend, Farid, as they worked in the field. Farid chuckled, shaking his head. "You heard El Naddaha, didn't you? My uncle swore he heard her once too. Said it nearly drove him mad. You shouldn't sit by the river at night, Omar." "I don't believe in fairy tales," Omar replied, though his voice held a note of doubt. But the following night, the voice returned. Stronger this time. It called to him, drawing him closer to the river's edge. He fought the urge to follow it, gripping the coarse earth beneath him to ground himself. Omar. The voice was hypnotic, pulling him with an unseen force. He wanted to resist, but something deep inside him stirred, longing to answer the call. The third night, Omar could no longer resist. He found himself walking, almost in a trance, toward the water. The moonlight shimmered on the surface of the Nile, illuminating a figure in the distance, a woman. She stood ankle-deep in the river, her hair flowing like dark silk over her shoulders. Her eyes gleamed in the moonlight, and her voice, oh, her voice. "Omar, come closer." He couldn't stop himself. His legs moved as if under someone else's command, drawing him nearer to the water's edge. The woman's smile widened, and for a moment, her beauty seemed to mask the danger that lurked beneath. But as Omar took another step, something snapped inside him. His grandmother's warning echoed in his mind. El Naddaha is always waiting. Omar hesitated, his foot hovering over the water's edge. The woman's eyes narrowed. Her voice, once sweet, took on an edge of impatience. "Come to me, Omar." Suddenly, a hand grabbed his arm, pulling him back with a sharp tug. Farid stood behind him, eyes wide with terror. "What are you doing?" he shouted, dragging Omar away from the river. The woman's face twisted in fury, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Her voice became a scream, shrill and piercing. The water around her began to churn violently, rising like a wave ready to crash down upon them. "Run!" Farid yelled, yanking Omar back toward the village. The two men sprinted through the fields, the sound of El Naddaha's screeching fading as they fled. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of Omar's house, both panting and drenched in sweat. That night, Omar's grandmother found him sitting by the fire, his face pale, as he recounted what had happened. She listened in silence, her eyes heavy with knowing. "She won't stop," his grandmother said softly. "Once she calls your name, she never stops." The next few nights were restless for Omar. He no longer went to the river, but the voice followed him. In his dreams, she called to him, her voice echoing in his mind. Each night he woke in a cold sweat, her words lingering in the darkness. "Omar." On the fourth night, the dreams stopped. The village seemed quieter than usual, the air thick with an unsettling calm. Omar felt a strange sense of relief, thinking it was finally over. But as he walked down the village road, he passed by the river once more, and from its depths he heard the faintest whisper, "El Naddaha never forgets." The small village of Al-Qusair was nestled deep within the desert, a place where time seemed to stand still. Life was simple, but the villagers carried a burden, an ancient legend that had been whispered for generations. It was said that once, a creature called El Salawa roamed the outskirts of the village, a terrifying beast that was neither wolf nor hyena, but something in between. It prowled under the cover of darkness, hunting those foolish enough to stray too far from the safety of their homes. Hassan, a 17-year-old boy with a restless heart, didn't believe in legends. His father, however, was a firm believer. "El Salawa is no myth," his father would say, with grave seriousness. "Stay close to the village, Hassan. I've seen the tracks myself." Hassan would nod respectfully, but deep down, he believed the stories were just tales to keep children from wandering off into the desert. It was only when the livestock began disappearing that Hassan started to reconsider. First, it was the goats. Then, a few camels went missing. Each time, there were no signs of struggle, just enormous paw prints in the sand and the faint echo of a growl at night. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Hassan's best friend, Yusef, suggested something wild. "Let's find El Salawa." Hassan laughed it off. "Are you serious?" "It's just a story, Yusef." "Then what's taking our animals?" Yusef shot back, his voice filled with a mix of fear and determination. "If it's real, we need to stop it before it takes more." Against his better judgment, Hassan agreed. The two boys set out that night, armed with nothing more than flashlights and an old rifle Yusef had stolen from his father. The desert air was cool, but there was a heaviness to it, like the world was holding its breath. They followed the tracks leading out of the village, the deep paw prints clearer now under the moonlight. Every so often, they would hear a distant growl, but each time it seemed to come from a different direction, as if the creature was circling them. "This isn't a good idea," Hassan muttered, scanning the horizon. The desert stretched out endlessly before them, empty except for the occasional dune. "We'll be fine," Yusef whispered, though his grip tightened on the rifle. Suddenly, a loud snarl echoed through the night, freezing them both in place. From the shadows, a figure emerged, massive, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow in the darkness. It was El Salawa, its body hunched like a hyena's, but larger and more menacing. Its fur was matted and dirty, and its jaws hung open, revealing rows of sharp teeth that gleamed in the moonlight. Hassan's heart raced, his legs trembled, but he couldn't move. Yusef raised the rifle, his hands shaking as he aimed. Before he could pull the trigger, El Salawa charged. Hassan shoved Yusef out of the way, just as the beast leaped toward them. They scrambled to their feet, running blindly through the desert, the sound of El Salawa's heavy paws thudding behind them. "We can't outrun it," Yusef gasped. "There's a cave ahead," Hassan shouted, his voice filled with desperation. They dove inside, just as El Salawa's claws swiped at them, missing by inches. The cave was narrow, its walls jagged and rough. The boys pressed themselves against the stone, panting and trembling. Outside, El Salawa prowled, its growls low and menacing. Its shadow cast large against the cave entrance. "We're trapped," Yusef whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of their labored breathing. Hassan's mind raced. They couldn't stay here forever. El Salawa would eventually get in. But then, a memory surfaced. Something his father had once told him about the creature. "It fears fire," Hassan said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "We need to make a torch." Yusef looked around, panicked. With what? Hassan spotted a stick near the cave entrance, probably left by some traveler long ago. He grabbed it, wrapping his shirt around one end. "Light it with your flashlight," he said. Yusef hesitated, but did as he was told. The fabric caught fire, casting a warm glow in the cave. El Salawa snarled from outside, its eyes narrowing as the light flickered against the walls. "We need to drive it away," Hassan said, standing up. With the torch in hand, he slowly approached the entrance. El Salawa recoiled, snarling, but not retreating. "Get back," Hassan shouted, thrusting the torch forward. The creature growled, but stepped back, its eyes never leaving Hassan. Step by step, the boys edged out of the cave, keeping the torch between them and the beast. El Salawa circled them, its growls deepening, but it didn't attack. Finally, with one last snarl, it turned and vanished into the desert, its glowing eyes disappearing into the night. The boys collapsed, exhausted but alive. "We did it," Yusef whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Hassan nodded, his heart still pounding in his chest. But as they made their way back to the village, he couldn't shake the feeling that El Salawa was still out there, watching them from the shadows, waiting for another chance to strike. That night, as Hassan lay in bed, his father's words echoed in his mind. El Salawa is no myth. And for the first time, Hassan believed him. In a crowded neighborhood of Cairo, where the ancient and modern collide, lived a young man named Amr. He was 18, a recent high school graduate with big dreams of leaving the crowded streets of the city to study architecture abroad. But until that day came, he helped his father in their small grocery shop near the old market. Life in the city was tough, but Amr had a strong heart and believed that hard work would take him far. However, there was one thing that haunted him. Since childhood, his grandmother had warned him about the black cat, a spirit in the form of a cat, said to be cursed and able to take revenge on those who disrespected the old ways. "Never harm a black cat," she would say, her eyes wide with fear. "They are protectors of ancient souls, and to harm one will bring a curse upon you." Amr, like most young people, didn't take these stories seriously. But things changed one summer night. It was late, and Amr was closing up the shop when he heard a strange sound, a low, growling hiss. He turned and saw a black cat sitting on the sidewalk, its yellow eyes glowing in the dim light of the street lamp. "Go away. Shoo." Amr waved his hand, trying to scare it off, but the cat didn't move. It stared at him, unblinking. Annoyed, Amr grabbed a rock and threw it at the cat. The rock hit the ground near it, and the cat hissed again, louder this time, before disappearing into the shadows. Shaking his head, Amr closed the shop and headed home, thinking nothing more of it. But that night, everything changed. Amr lay in bed, the ceiling fan spinning lazily above him, when he heard scratching at his window. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. He got up and opened the window, peering outside into the alley. Nothing, but as he turned back to bed, he froze. There, sitting on his windowsill, was the black cat from earlier, its eyes glowing eerily in the darkness. Amar's heart raced. "How did you get up here?" He tried to shoo it away again, but the cat didn't move. Instead, it let out a long, low growl that sent shivers down his spine. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it jumped off the windowsill and vanished into the night. Amar tried to calm down, telling himself it was just a stray cat, but sleep wouldn't come easily that night. He tossed and turned, haunted by strange dreams, visions of ancient temples, golden statues of cats, and shadowy figures watching him from the darkness. The next morning, Amar felt uneasy. His mind was filled with thoughts of the cat, the warning from his grandmother, and the vivid nightmares. But he pushed the fear aside, determined not to let superstition rule his life. As he went about his day, strange things started happening. His father's shop door wouldn't open, even though there was nothing wrong with the lock. A shelf of cans fell without anyone touching it, and the black cat appeared again, watching him from the street, always from a distance, but always there. Maybe it's just a coincidence, Amar muttered to himself, though he didn't believe it. Later that evening, his best friend Khaled came to visit. They sat in the small living room, watching TV and laughing, trying to shake off the strange events. But when Khaled noticed Amar's nervous glances out the window, he frowned. "What's going on with you?" Amar hesitated, then told Khaled about the cat. "It's just a stray, but it's everywhere I go. I can't shake this feeling that something's wrong." Khaled laughed. "It's just a cat, man. You're letting those old stories get to your head." Amar wanted to believe him, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. That night, the nightmares returned, more vivid than ever. He dreamt of a tomb, hidden beneath the desert sands, guarded by statues of black cats. In his dream, Amar entered the tomb, and the statue's eyes followed him as he walked deeper into the darkness. He awoke with a start, drenched in sweat. But this time, it wasn't just a dream. The room felt cold, unnaturally so, and the sound of scratching came from the door. Slowly, Amar got up and opened it. There, standing in the hallway, was the black cat. But something was different. Its eyes glowed brighter, and its body seemed larger, more menacing. Amar backed away, fear gripping his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to hurt you." The cat growled, its fur bristling, and for a moment, Amar thought it would attack. But then, it slowly turned and walked toward the door, disappearing into the shadows once more. The next morning, Amar knew what he had to do. He visited his grandmother's old house, searching for answers. In the attic, he found an old book filled with ancient Egyptian symbols and spells. Among the pages, he discovered a section about the guardians of the dead, black cats that protected the souls of the departed. With a heavy heart, Amar returned to the spot where he had first seen the cat. He knelt down and whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't understand." For a long moment, nothing happened. But then, out of the shadows, the black cat appeared once more. It looked at him, its eyes no longer glowing with malice, but with something else. Understanding. Amar stood up, feeling a weight lift from his chest, as the cat slowly walked away, vanishing into the alley. The curse had been lifted, but Amar would never forget the lesson he had learned. Some legends weren't just stories.